The alien queen thought she married an ordinary human, until he revealed his hidden identity. The docking clamps hit the hull with a sound like a gunshot, and I was already moving before the echo died. I had 14 seconds before the Valkyrie Port Authority scanner completed its sweep. 14 seconds to make sure the cargo manifest matched what was physically in the hold, that the false bulkhead in Bay 3 showed nothing but compressed silicon ore, and that the name on my travel papers looked like it belonged to someone who had never once been inside a classified military installation. My name on those papers was Marcus Cole, simple, forgettable, the kind of name that slid off memory the moment someone stopped looking at it. I grabbed my coat from the hook beside the airlock, checked the inside pocket where the data chip sat wrapped in a layer of insulated cloth, and stepped out onto the loading platform of Valkyrie Prime's secondary port, the one the Empire used for foreign traders, kept deliberately run down so visitors felt properly small. It worked on most people. I had been to worse places. The air hit me first. It was thick, mineral-heavy, carrying the faint tang of something that smelled like copper and old rain. The gravity was slightly higher than Earth standard, enough to make your knees aware of it after a long walk, not enough to slow you down if you kept your posture right. I kept mine right. I always did. The port was enormous. That was the point. The Valkyrie built everything enormous, because enormity was a language they used before they opened their mouths. The ceiling vaults above the docking bay were carved from a single piece of deep red stone, etched with the names of every empire the Valkyrie had absorbed or outlasted. There were a lot of names. I had read all of them before I came here. I joined the line of traders moving through the entry checkpoint. Ahead of me was a Soravan merchant with 4 arms and a face like hammered bronze, pulling a cart loaded with spice containers. Behind me was a thin man from the outer Meridian colonies who kept nervously adjusting his collar. Neither of them looked at me. That was good. The checkpoint officer was Valkyrie, tall, almost 2.5 meters, with a segmented neck and eyes that caught the light like polished amber. Her uniform was the deep black of the Imperial Trade Authority, with a single red stripe on the shoulder that told me she was senior enough to cause problems, but not senior enough to actually know what she was looking at. She scanned my papers. She looked at the cargo manifest. She looked at me. I looked back without any particular expression. Silicon ore, she said. Her translator rendered the words in flat, clipped tones. From the Harrow Belt. What's left of it, I said. She studied me for another moment. This was the part where most traders got nervous. They started talking too much, offering explanations nobody had asked for, smiling in ways that looked wrong. I did none of those things. I just waited, like a man with nothing to hide and nowhere urgently to be. She stamped the papers and waved me through. I walked into Valkyrie Prime without looking back. The city beyond the port was called Velrath, the heart of the Empire, in their oldest dialect. It was the oldest continuously occupied city in this sector of the galaxy, built on a plateau above a sea of amber-colored cloud that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The buildings were the same red stone as the port, stacked in spiraling tiers that climbed toward a central tower so tall its upper levels were lost in the permanent haze above. The streets were wide and clean and utterly serious. Nobody laughed on these streets. Nobody moved without purpose. I fit right in. I had 3 objectives. The first was to meet my contact, a Valkyrie archivist named Selvan who had been feeding information to human intelligence networks for 11 years, motivated by a philosophical disagreement with his empire that was too complicated to explain quickly and too important to ignore. The second was to retrieve a data package he had assembled. 12 years of Valkyrie military positioning logs, coded in a format that would take our people 4 months to fully decode, but would, when decoded, tell us exactly where the Empire was and was not prepared to defend itself. The third objective was to leave without anyone knowing I had been here for anything other than silicon ore. What I had not planned for was the announcement that came through every public speaker in the city at exactly the 3rd hour of the afternoon, broadcast in 6 languages simultaneously and accompanied by the full weight of imperial ceremony. I was crossing the market district when it happened. The speakers crackled. Everyone on the street stopped moving. I stopped too, because stopping when everyone else stopped was the right thing to do, and I was very good at doing the right thing when being watched. The voice that came through the speakers was the Imperial Heralds, a position that existed solely to deliver news so significant It required a dedicated human being, trained from childhood to make words sound like history. The Empire of Velkari, the herald announced, had entered negotiations with the Human Confederation for a permanent treaty of mutual non-aggression. To seal this treaty, in accordance with ancient tradition, the bonds between the two peoples would be formalized through a voluntary union. A human citizen, chosen from those currently present on Velkari Prime, would enter into a formal marriage bond with the imperial crown. This was not an act of conquest. This was an act of humility on the part of the empire, a gesture of good faith. Then the herald read the name from the docking registry. My name. Not my real name. The name on my papers. Marcus Cole, Silicon Ore Trader, Bay 17, Secondary Port. I stood very still on the street while the city moved around me, everyone turning to look at each other with the particular expression of beings who had just witnessed something historically significant and were trying to figure out what to do with their faces. A junior official found me 20 minutes later. She was young, professionally apologetic, and clearly terrified that I would refuse. She explained that the selection was random, drawn from the registry of all human citizens currently on planet. She explained that I had every right to decline, but that declining would be noted in the official record and might complicate future trade permissions. I let her explain everything. I asked 2 careful questions about what the bond actually required. I looked at the middle distance for a while, like a man wrestling with an unexpected decision. Then I said yes. She exhaled so hard she almost lost her balance. I said yes because declining would have drawn exactly the wrong kind of attention. I said yes because the bond would give me access to the Imperial Palace, which contained archives that made Selvan's data package look like a pamphlet. I said yes because I had been studying the Velkari for 6 years, and I had come to understand their queen in a way that surprised even me, and I believed, not as a strategy but as a genuine assessment, that this treaty was worth making real. And I said yes because of something else, something I did not examine too closely in that moment. Something that had to do with a single photograph in a diplomatic file and a recorded speech I had listened to 3 times more than was professionally necessary. But I told myself it was strategy. It was easier that way. They put me in a guest suite in the east wing of the Imperial compound that same evening. The room was large enough to park a shuttle in, furnished in the Velkari style. Clean lines, heavy stone, a window that looked out over the amber cloud sea glowing in the last light of the system's star. A protocol officer spent 2 hours explaining the ceremony procedures, the expected behaviors, the things I should not say or do in the presence of the crown. I listened carefully. I remembered everything. That was not a skill I had practiced. It was something I had been born with, and then spent 20 years sharpening until it was dangerous. When the protocol officer left, I stood at the window for a while. The cloud sea below moved slowly, great rolls and eddies catching the dying light. Orange and gold and a deep, bruised purple at the edges, where the shadow of the plateau cut across it. My communicator had been confiscated at the compound entrance. Standard procedure. No outside communication for treaty participants during the bonding preparation period. I had expected that. The communicator they had taken was the one I was carrying publicly. The other one, the flat chip sewn into the lining of my boot, was still there. I did not use it that night. There was nothing to report yet. And using it unnecessarily was the kind of habit that got people identified. Instead, I ran through what I knew. I knew the queen's name, Zalsarath. I knew her age in their calendar system, which translated to somewhere between 60 and 70 by human reckoning, though the Velkari aged slowly enough that she would look, by their standards, like a being in early middle age. I knew she had ruled for 31 years, that she had inherited the throne after her predecessor's death in a border conflict, that she had spent the first decade of her rule consolidating power against 4 separate faction uprisings, and that she had won each time with a combination of military precision and political shrewdness that most of our analysts considered the most impressive governance record in the current galactic period. I knew she was feared by her enemies, respected by her allies, and quietly admired even by the diplomats who publicly complained about her. I knew she was not going to like me. People like her never liked people like me when they first met us. We were too quiet, too hard to read. It made them feel like they were missing something. They were, but that was the point. I went to sleep at the standard hour, because sleeping when you should was part of maintaining the shape of a person who had nothing to worry about. In the morning, they came to prepare me for the ceremony. The preparation took 4 hours. There were robes, formal Velkari ceremonial dress, adapted for a human frame, which meant they had measured me at some point, without my being aware of it, and had done it accurately, which I filed as a data point about their intelligence capabilities. There were symbolic markings applied to the hands and throat. Not permanent, a protocol officer assured me. Just traditional. The markings were in a pigment that dried to a dark gold color and carried a faint scent of something like cedar and deep water. There were also tests. They did not call them that, but that was what they were. The chief ritual officer, an elder Velkari, with amber eyes so pale they were nearly white, led me through a series of readings and responses, traditional call-and-answer phrases that the bonded pair were expected to know. He watched me the way a person watches a door they expect to open, waiting for the moment of passage. I gave the responses correctly. I had memorized them from public records 2 years ago, when the possibility of this treaty had first appeared as a probability in our projection models. The elder studied me for a long moment after the final response. His expression was impossible for me to read. Velkari facial musculature worked differently from ours, and subtle shifts in their features carried meaning that took years to learn. But something in the angle of his gaze and the stillness of his neck made me think the word unexpected had occurred to him. He said nothing. He gestured to the door that led to the ceremony hall. I walked through it. The hall was the largest interior space I had ever stood in. The vaulted ceiling was high enough that the upper reaches were in shadow, despite the rows of light fixtures that lined the walls, each burning with the pale blue flame of a traditional Velkari ceremonial torch. The floor was the same deep red stone as everything else in this city, polished to a mirror shine. The gathered court stood in formal rows on either side of the central aisle, hundreds of them, armored and robed and utterly silent, watching me walk toward the far end of the hall with the particular quality of attention that powerful beings reserve for things they have not decided how to categorize yet. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform of black stone, stood Zal Sarath. I had seen photographs. Photographs had not been adequate preparation. She was tall even by Velkari standards, her spine straight as a blade, her robes the color of deep space, black with a faint iridescence that shifted as she moved, catching light and releasing it in ways that suggested the person wearing them was not someone you should consider approaching carelessly. Her eyes, even at this distance, were extraordinary. A deep, layered amber with inner rings of darker gold, the kind of eyes that had been watching things for a long time and had learned to see past surfaces. She was watching me. Not the way the court was watching me, measuring, uncertain, trying to place me in a known category. She was watching me the way someone watches a piece of information they have not yet decided what to do with, analytically, quietly, without any of the performative disdain that the rest of the court was managing poorly enough that even I could read it. I walked the full length of the hall without looking away from her. That was a test too, though nobody had told me it was. The human consort was supposed to lower their eyes at the halfway point, a gesture of deference that the ceremony texts described as traditional. I did not lower my eyes. I heard the faintest shift in the breathing of the assembled court. 100 beings deciding, simultaneously, whether what they had just seen was an insult or something else. I reached the platform. I stepped up onto it. I stood 2 meters from Zal Sarath of the Velkari Empire, and looked at her the way one professional looks at another, with clear and uncomplicated respect. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did, just slightly, just enough. The elder who had tested me appeared at the side of the platform and began the formal words of the bonding ceremony. I followed the responses. My accent in the Velkari ceremonial dialect was not perfect. I had deliberately practiced it to be good but not flawless, because fluency in their language would have raised questions I was not ready to answer yet. The ceremony had 7 stages. I will not describe all of them. Most were formal recitation, symbolic gestures, the kind of structured ritual that exists in every culture, as a container for meaning, too large to speak plainly. But the 5th stage was the one that mattered, the one the protocol officer had told me to prepare for carefully. It was called the trial of bearing. The bonded pair faced each other. The elder pressed his hand against the pressure point on the side of each participant's neck, a location that, in Velkari physiology, produced a sharp and sustained discomfort when compressed, not enough to cause harm, but enough to test composure. The expected response of the human consort, according to every piece of documentation I had read, was a visible expression of endurance, a controlled grimace, eyes that stayed open with effort, something that showed the court the human was being tested and was managing to bear it. The elder's hand found the pressure point on my neck. He pressed. It was uncomfortable. The Velkari nervous system and the human one were different enough that the effect was not identical, but the discomfort was real, a sustained, drilling pressure that moved into the shoulder and up behind the ear and stayed there. I felt it clearly. And then, because I genuinely could not help it, because the situation had a particular quality of absurdity that I had always found funny, and because I had spent too many years in environments where not laughing was the harder discipline, I smiled. And then, quietly, I laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a laugh that was hiding something painful, a real laugh, short and low, the kind that escapes when something strikes you as genuinely funny. The elder stopped pressing. He looked at me. The court had gone so quiet I could hear the ceremonial torches burning. Zalsarath, for the first time, showed something on her face that I could read without any knowledge of Velkari physiology. It was the look of someone who has encountered a variable they had not included in their calculations. It lasted half a second before her composure closed back over it like water over a stone. The elder completed the ceremony. The words were spoken. The bond was formally declared. I was, by the laws of the Velkari Empire, the consort of the queen. I was escorted to the consort's wing of the palace by 6 guards who were polite, in the way that people are polite when they are not sure what they are dealing with. The wing was smaller than the guest suite I had occupied the night before, deliberately smaller, the protocol officer had explained, because the consort's quarters were meant to reflect the humble nature of the role. They were still 3 times the size of any home I had lived in. The Velkari idea of humility was instructive. That evening, one of the palace staff, a young Velkari who was either genuinely assigned to serve the consort's wing or was there to observe me, possibly both, brought food and tried to make conversation. I was friendly and unremarkable and gave him nothing useful to report. When he was gone, I sat on the edge of the sleeping surface and looked at the wall for a while. I turned over the day in my mind, placing each thing that had happened in its proper relation to everything else. The tattoo on the inside of my left wrist had not glowed. I needed to correct that piece of information from whatever story would later be told about this. It did not glow. It never glowed. It was not that kind of mark. But the elder had seen it during the ceremonial gestures, when my sleeve had shifted, and the expression that had crossed his face was one I had seen before, on faces that recognized something they had no context for, but knew instinctively they should remember. I pulled my sleeve down. Outside, the city of Velrath continued its serious, purposeful business below the amber cloud sea. Somewhere in the upper levels of the central tower, in chambers I did not yet have access to but was already thinking about how to reach, Zalsarath was reading whatever her intelligence staff had assembled about Marcus Cole, silicon ore trader. It would not take her long to notice the gaps. She was too good at her work not to notice the gaps. I found I was not worried about that. I was, if anything, curious what she would do with them. I went to sleep at the standard hour. In the palace above me, something had shifted. I could not have said exactly what. It was the particular quality of stillness that falls over a place when someone very intelligent is thinking very hard about a question that does not have an easy answer. I had been the subject of that kind of thinking before. I had survived it before. This time, for the first time in a long time, surviving it was not the only thing I was thinking about. The first time I saw the reports on my new consort, I read them twice. Then I set them down and looked out the window at the cloud sea for longer than was customary, because I needed a moment to decide what the reports were actually telling me. My name is Zalsarath. I have ruled this empire for 31 years. I have read 10,000 intelligence reports in that time, and I have learned, as all rulers must learn, to find the thing in each report that the writer did not mean to include, the gaps, the hesitations, the places where certainty runs out and something has been smoothed over to look like more certainty than exists. The report on Marcus Cole was full of gaps. He was listed as a registered independent trader, operating under a single-vessel commercial license issued from the Harrow Belt Administrative Station 7 years ago. Before the Harrow Belt, there were records of a colonial address, a small outer settlement called Crail's Point, now classified as a lost site following a Drakfor border incident. He had no living family on record. He had no military service record. He had no credit history of significant scale. He paid his port fees on time. He had once been issued a minor citation for an improperly sealed cargo container on a station in the neutral corridor. That was everything. For a man who had been alive for, the report estimated, somewhere between 35 and 45 years, that was almost nothing. I have studied humans. It was necessary, as their confederation grew from a regional curiosity into a genuine political force, to understand what they were. I read their histories, their scientific literature, their philosophical traditions. I reviewed the intelligence assessments that my analysts had produced over the past 2 decades, noting with private amusement how consistently those assessments had underestimated the species. Humans were difficult to model because they were, individually, inconsistent. They made decisions based on factors that a clear strategic analysis would never generate. They formed emotional attachments that compromised their judgment. They were fragile, in ways that their biology made embarrassing by galactic standards. And yet they kept surviving. They kept building. They kept appearing in places they should not have been able to reach, doing things they should not have had the resources to do, and refusing to behave as predicted. I had selected a human consort for this bond, because the treaty required it, and because I believed in honoring the terms of agreements, precisely as written, not approximately. I had not selected Marcus Cole. That had been the registry draw. But I had reviewed the candidates in advance of the ceremony, and I had noted his name on the list and thought nothing particular about it. I was thinking a great deal about it now. He had not lowered his eyes on the walk to the platform. That was not a trivial observation. Every human who had visited this court in any formal capacity had been briefed extensively on the ceremony protocol. They all lowered their eyes at the midpoint. It was instinctive by the time they reached the platform. The weight of the ceremony, the scale of the hall, the assembled court, the queen at the far end all combined to produce a reflexive deference in beings who were not trained to suppress it. He had not suppressed it. He had simply not had it. There was a difference, and the difference was significant. Then the trial of bearing. I had watched the pressure applied, and I had watched his face, and I had been prepared for any of the standard responses, the contained wince, the eyes tightening, the careful control of breath. What I had not been prepared for was a laugh, quiet, unperformed, and entirely genuine. There was only one explanation for that response. The discomfort was real. Our physiology was different enough that I had not been certain the trial would produce the same effect in a human, but his initial reaction had told me it did. The laugh had not been a cover for pain. It had been, against all probability, a genuine expression of amusement. What was funny about it? That was the question I kept returning to. What does a person find funny about being formally tested by an alien empire's ritual in front of several hundred spectators? The answer I kept arriving at was, a person who had been through enough genuinely difficult things that this particular situation did not register on the same scale. I had one of my senior intelligence officers, Velran, come to my study that evening. Velran had served in the intelligence division for 23 years and had a manner of delivering unwelcome information that I appreciated. Flat, precise, entirely without softening. I told him what I wanted, a deeper search on Marcus Cole, not the standard registry poll, not the surface-level trade records. Everything, the infrastructure behind the name, the actual paper trail beneath the official one, the kind of search that took weeks and was not supposed to exist. Velran looked at me with the professional calm I paid him for and asked what I expected to find. I said I did not know. That was the problem. He left to begin the work. I spent the next 3 days observing my new consort through the normal mechanisms of palace life, staff reports, the observations of my security detail, the incidental interactions that the household routine generated. I had made clear to the household staff that the consort was to be treated with courtesy and given appropriate access to the common areas of the palace compound. I had not said this because I was concerned about his comfort. I said it because a person given reasonable freedom moves differently than a person who feels confined, and I wanted to see how he moved. He moved quietly. That was the first thing every report noted. He did not create sound when he crossed a room. He sat in the library for long periods, reading texts from the open collection, with what the supervising scholar described as genuine absorption. He asked questions, polite, specific questions about the history of particular artifacts he found in the common gallery, that the staff answered and then later, when writing their reports, struggled to explain why the questions had seemed slightly off, not rude, not suspicious, just calibrated in a way that felt like more than casual curiosity. He exercised alone before the first hour of morning, using a sequence that my physical training advisor, who observed through the secondary corridor without the consort's knowledge, described as military in structure, not like anything in the Confederation's known public exercise doctrine, more compact, more focused on specific capacities. He ate what was placed in front of him without complaint, asked no questions about ingredients, and spent mealtimes in what appeared to be genuine observation of the room around him. He thanked the staff. They liked him. That last detail made me suspicious in a way I could not immediately explain. On the fourth day, I decided to see him directly. This was not unusual. The consort's role included a formal period of integration, shared meals, shared ceremonial appearances, a gradual incorporation into palace life that served the political purpose of demonstrating the bond's reality to the empire's observers. I had intended to begin this period at the standard interval, in 2 weeks. I moved it earlier. He was in the eastern garden when I arrived. It was not a large garden, a formal space of clipped plants and arranged stone that the Velkari used for private conversation, positioned on a terrace above the cloud sea. The morning air was sharp and cold. He was sitting on one of the low stone benches, not doing anything in particular, not reading, not exercising, not working at anything, just sitting and watching the cloud sea move. He heard me approach. I could tell because his posture shifted, not dramatically, not defensively, just the small adjustment of a person who has become aware of another presence and decided what to do about it. He turned when I was a few steps away. He looked at me the same way he had looked at me in the ceremony hall. Direct, quiet, no excess in it, no performance of ease, and no performance of nerves. Just a person, looking at another person, thinking. "Your Majesty," he said. His use of my title was grammatically correct, and utterly without subservience. "Marcus Cole," I said. I watched his face when I said the name. There was nothing to see. No microscopic tightening, no flicker of the eyes. "Sit," I added. It was not a request, but I had not used the tone of command either. It was somewhere between the two, which was where I found most of my useful conversations happened. He sat. I sat across from him on the facing bench. The cloud sea moved below us in great slow sweeps. "Tell me something true about yourself," I said. He considered that for a moment. Not the way people consider things when they are stalling, the way people consider things when they are selecting among options. "I sleep exactly as much as I need to, and no more," he said. "I have never once in my life been late for anything, and I find this city genuinely impressive, which I say not to be polite, but because I mean it." I looked at him. "Those are the things you chose. You asked for something true. You didn't specify what kind. I am asking what kind now." He met my eyes. "The kind that doesn't give away anything you don't already know. Which is the same kind you'd give me, in this conversation, if our positions were reversed." The cloud sea moved. A current of warmer air from below came up over the terrace edge, briefly, carrying the faint mineral smell of the atmosphere above the plateau. I had spoken with heads of state, military commanders, rival rulers, scholars, and philosophers. Very few of them had ever said something in a first real conversation that made me want to hear the next thing they said. This man had just done it twice. I said, "You didn't lower your eyes." "No." "Why not?" He looked out at the cloud sea for a moment. I wasn't being disrespectful. I was being accurate. Lowering my eyes in that situation would have been a performance of something I wasn't feeling. I don't perform things I'm not feeling. I find it wastes time. The court read it as disrespect. "I know. Does that concern you?" I studied him. "What makes you think it wouldn't?" "Because you came to talk to me," he said. "If their reading of it had matched yours, you'd have sent someone else." The morning light shifted as a high cloud crossed the system's star. The garden went briefly dimmer, and then bright again. I left after another 20 minutes. The conversation had not gone in any direction I had planned. I found, as I walked back through the palace corridors, that I was mentally reviewing it with an attention I usually reserved for genuine strategic problems. I had spent 31 years being very good at reading people. I had survived in a position that required reading people correctly, because the alternative was the kind of ending that did not allow for corrections. I could read my generals, my advisors, my rivals, the foreign diplomats who sat across my table and thought they were concealing more than they were. I could read them because they all, ultimately, wanted something obvious: power, survival, comfort, recognition. And wanting obvious things made people readable. Marcus Cole wanted something. Every person wants something. But I could not read what it was, and that had not happened to me in a very long time. Velran found me in the afternoon with his preliminary report. He stood in the doorway of my study with an expression that, from Velran, was the equivalent of another being's open concern. The trade license was clean, he said. The colonial records from Crail's Point were genuine. The commercial history was real. But it was thin. It was the thinnest, legitimate history he had seen for a person of this age, who had not specifically attempted to create a thin history. It was the kind of thinness that appeared when a real history had been reconstructed carefully from the outside, rather than lived from the inside. He could not prove it, but the shape of it was wrong. I told him to keep looking. That night, I reviewed the recording from the ceremony, the continuous documentation that the palace archives maintained for every formal event. I watched the trial of Bering 3 times. I watched his face carefully. I watched the moment the laugh escaped, and I watched what happened in the half-second before it. Before the laugh, there was something. A very brief response to the discomfort. Real, not performed. And then something settled in him. Not suppression. Something that looked more like categorization, as if he had filed the discomfort in a part of his mind that was designed for things that could be endured and moved on from, and then that part of his mind had closed, and what remained was a man sitting in a ceremony hall who found the entire situation somewhat funny. I stopped the recording. I thought about what category of experience produced that kind of internal organization, what a person had to have lived through to develop that filing system, that capacity to place discomfort in its proper box without drama or performance. I thought about a colonial settlement called Crail's Point, and what the Drakvor border incident that had destroyed it had actually looked like. I thought about a man who had no family on record, no history of any weight, nothing to anchor him to any past, and who had laughed in the middle of an imperial ceremony. I turned off the recording and stared at the ceiling for a while. He was not a traitor. I was almost certain of it now. The question was what he actually was, and the answer to that question was something I did not have yet. I decided I would find it. I was very patient and very thorough, and I had all the resources of an empire at my disposal. What I had not accounted for was that the search was going to take much longer than I expected, because someone had been very careful, for a very long time, to make sure people like me looked in exactly the wrong places. 2 days later, one of my personal guards was found in the corridor outside the consort's wing, unconscious, not harmed, not a mark on him, not a bruise, just fully, deeply unconscious, as if placed there by someone who had precisely enough knowledge of Velkari physiology to find the nerve cluster that produced total system shutdown without injury. The guard had been placed on that corridor because I had asked, through channels I trusted, to have the consort's movements observed overnight. I stood over the unconscious guard and looked at the door at the end of the corridor and felt, for the first time in 3 decades, something that I would not name as fear, but that lived in the same neighborhood. I asked myself, very quietly, what I had brought into my palace. I did not have an answer. I was beginning to think the answer was going to be something the galaxy had never quite prepared me for. The Drakvor spy's name was Harvin. He was embedded in the palace as a data systems technician and had been there for 2 years before I found him, which meant he was competent enough to have spent 2 years invisible, not competent enough to have accounted for me. I want to be clear. I had not come to Velkari Prime expecting to dismantle a Drakvor intelligence network. That was not on my list of objectives. My list had 3 items, and none of them involved foreign agents embedded in an alien imperial court. But the thing about intelligence networks is that once you know one thread of them exists, you follow the thread, because leaving a known thread unpulled is the kind of mistake that comes back at the worst possible time. I had found Harvin on my 4th day in the palace. I found him the same way I found most embedded agents, not through dramatic investigation, but through the simple discipline of watching what people looked at when they thought no one was watching them. Most people, when they have something they are working to conceal, develop a habit of periodically reassuring themselves that the concealment is holding. They glance toward it. Just briefly, but the glance is always there. Harvin looked at the secondary server access point in the Eastern Archive corridor every time he walked past it. He was good enough to vary his route, good enough to make each glance look accidental, good enough that no one who was not specifically watching for that kind of behavior would have noticed. But I was specifically watching for that kind of behavior, because watching for it is something I do automatically now, the way some people check the weather. The access point was where he was uploading data, small packets, carefully timed, hidden inside routine diagnostic signals. The data he was sending included internal palace scheduling, guard rotation patterns, and, I confirmed this on the 3rd day of watching him, fragments of the deeper intelligence search that Velran had initiated on Marcus Cole. That last piece was the one that made me move. I waited until Harvin was working a night shift in the archive corridor. I came through the service passage that the palace technical staff used, which connected to the corridor through a maintenance panel that opened silently if you knew the correct sequence. I had learned the sequence from the building schematics I had studied in the week before the ceremony, back when I was still on the ship and reading everything I could find about this place. Harvin turned around when he heard the panel close. He was faster than average, hand moving toward the emergency signal device on his belt. Not fast enough. I was already inside his reach, and I knew where the Velkari emergency signal devices were kept, and I knew the correct motion to prevent their use. We had a brief conversation. He told me several things he had not planned to tell me, and then I put him in the deep sleep that works on Velkari physiology, through precise pressure application. The same nerve cluster I had read about in the medical survey I had studied 18 months ago when Velkari biology became professionally relevant, and I carried him to the corner of the corridor and arranged him in a position that would be comfortable for the length of time he would be unconscious. Then I went back to my room and made tea. The guard outside my door was the one Zalsarath had placed there. I knew she had placed him there. I had known about him for 23 hours before I went to deal with Harvin, which meant I had walked past him, said something polite about the night air, and gone on my way, and then come back through a different route entirely. I was not trying to deceive her. I was trying to make sure that what happened in that corridor happened without a witness who would need to file a report that asked questions I was not ready to answer. I had not planned it perfectly. She found the guard in the morning, and I could tell from the quality of her silence at our next shared meal that she had updated her model of me significantly. She did not ask me about it directly. She asked me, instead, about my thoughts on the historical relationship between the Velkari and the Soravan Compact. I told her my thoughts, which were informed by about 40 hours of source material I was not supposed to have read. She listened with a stillness that told me she was doing two things at once, following the content of what I was saying and taking careful note of where it was coming from. After the meal, she excused herself. I watched her leave and thought that in another life, in circumstances where honesty was available as an option from the beginning, I would have very much liked to meet her as herself, with nothing to manage between us. That was not this life. Not yet. The Harvin situation produced a complication I had partially anticipated. His embedded network noticed his absence. Drakfor networks were designed with disappearance protocols. If a node went dark, the surrounding nodes shifted behavior to compensate and to conceal the gap. I had a window of about 6 days before the network's central reporting structure noticed that Harvin's data stream had stopped and sent someone to investigate. 6 days to find the rest of the network and deal with it in a way that looked like internal Velkari security work rather than external intervention. I spent 3 of those days in the library and the gallery and the Eastern Garden, being Marcus Cole, curious, quiet, unremarkable, gradually being incorporated into the rhythms of the palace. I had conversations with Zalsarath that were, in their structure, negotiations, each of us testing the shape of the other's thinking, neither of us giving more than we had decided to give. They were the best conversations I had had in years. She was extraordinary. I had known that intellectually, from study, from files, from the kind of remote admiration that analysis produces. Knowing it in person was different. She thought in long sequences, holding multiple threads of an argument simultaneously, and she was one of the very few people I had encountered who could be wrong about something and notice it in real time without making it an event. She updated, cleanly, quickly, without ego. That was rarer than any other trait I had spent my career finding in people. I spent the other 3 days of my window on the network. The second node was a kitchen supply manager named Preth, who was Velkari by birth, but had been compromised through debt and had been feeding dietary information and staff schedules for 8 months. He was not sophisticated. I left evidence of his activities in a form that the palace's own internal security division would find within 48 hours, framed in a way that made it look like he had been careless. He would be discovered through their own processes. That was cleaner. The third node was harder. She was a senior advisor to one of the court faction leaders, a Velkari named Velshan, who had been opposed to the human treaty from the beginning, and who had, I suspected, been deliberately cultivated by the Drakvor for exactly that reason. Her name was Tharsel, and she had been embedded so carefully, for so long, that she had stopped thinking of herself as embedded. She believed she was a patriot. She was passing information to people who were using her patriotism as a tool, and the saddest part was that she was doing it for reasons she had been carefully given, rather than reasons she had arrived at herself. I left Tharsel alone, not because she was not dangerous, but because the right way to handle her was not to expose her. It was to give her better information, more accurate information about what the Drakvor actually intended for the Velkari Empire if their interference succeeded. That was a slower approach, but it was the right one. On the day I finished mapping what I could of the network, Zalsareth arranged a formal court appearance for the two of us, a ceremonial presentation to the assembled noble houses, the traditional integration point for a new consort. I stood beside her on the raised platform at the center of the Great Hall and watched 400 members of the Velkari nobility assess me with varying degrees of visible skepticism. I watched them back, not confrontationally, calmly, noting who looked at me with pure contempt, who looked with calculation, who looked with something that might charitably be called curiosity, building a map. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, the Drakvor ambassador found me. His name was Rethvar, and he was a large being even by Drakvor standards, almost 3 meters tall, with the particular quality of physical confidence that very large beings develop when they have rarely encountered anything capable of making them reconsider it. He had been in the Velkari court for 3 years, officially as a trade liaison, actually as the senior intelligence presence for a power that had been slowly working to destabilize this empire from within. He stopped in front of me in the corridor. He looked down at me with the expression his species used when they found something simultaneously contemptible and briefly interesting. "The human consort," he said, in the trade tongue we both shared. "I have been curious to see you up close." His tone made it clear that close examination had not improved his assessment. "Ambassador Rethvar," I said pleasantly. He switched languages, away from the trade tongue, into a language I was not supposed to know. The Drakvor military command dialect. A language that had been effectively dead to outside speakers for 200 years, preserved only within their senior military structure, he said. In that language, something intended to be both dismissive and privately amusing, a comment about the spectacle of watching a primitive species representative elevated to the level of a noble court. I waited for him to finish. Then I replied, in the same language, in a military formal register, using the correct grammatical honorifics for addressing a superior officer, which he was not, but which I used because it was funnier that way. I said, "Your syntax is slightly archaic, Ambassador. The form you used in that last clause went out of common use about 40 years ago. The current phrasing would be better." Rethvar went very still. A being of that size going very still is a notable physical event. The corridor felt smaller suddenly. I smiled at him. Not a challenging smile. A friendly one. The kind that is worse. "It was nice to meet you," I said, in the trade tongue again, and walked back toward the palace's inner corridors at a comfortable pace. Behind me, I heard nothing. Not a word, not a sound. Just the particular silence of a very powerful being, processing something that had not appeared anywhere in his models. I turned the corner and let myself feel, just briefly, the satisfaction of a correctly executed moment. Then I put it away and started thinking about what he was going to do next. He was going to contact his network. He was going to ask for a full report on the human consort. He was going to discover that his network was 2 nodes short, and his main data pipeline had gone quiet 6 days ago. And then he was going to reach a conclusion that I needed him to reach. Not the right conclusion, but a specific wrong one. Specifically, I needed him to conclude that I was a Confederation intelligence asset, who had been placed here to run a network of my own, the same way his people ran theirs. A spy versus spy calculation. A known quantity, even if an unexpected one. Because what I actually was significantly more inconvenient than a spy. If he concluded spy, he would manage it. Adjust, reposition, play the long diplomatic game. If he concluded correctly, he would panic. And a panicking Drakvor with the ear of a war-minded fleet command was a problem that could only be solved in one of 2 ways. And the more efficient of those 2 ways involved actions I was not willing to take. So, spy. Let him think spy. That evening, Zalsareth came to the eastern garden at the same hour she always came. I had noticed the pattern. She used the garden as a thinking space, the way some people use movement, or solitude. She came when something required working through. She sat on the bench across from me. The cloud sea below had gone deep purple and orange in the evening light, the colors moving in slow, enormous waves. The Drakvor ambassador seemed unsettled after speaking with you, she said. Did he? My staff noted it. She was watching me with that analytical stillness. What did you say to him? I corrected his grammar. A pause. In what language? I looked at her. I had been thinking about this moment for 2 days, calibrating how much of it to give her, and in what form. The answer I arrived at was, enough to increase her caution regarding the ambassador, without enough to raise questions she was not ready for. A trade dialect, I said. He seemed to think I wouldn't know it. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus Cole, she said slowly, the way she said my name when she was using it as a category she was trying to fill. Yes. Where did a silicon ore trader from the outer colonies learn a trade dialect specific to the Drakvor military structure? I looked out at the cloud sea. I travel a lot. I pick things up. She made a sound that, in any language, translated to, we both know that is not an answer. I said, there are people in this court who are working against your interests, Majesty. That is not speculation. I would suggest, in the near term, reviewing the security clearances of anyone with access to dietary scheduling and to your intelligence division's internal search protocols. She was very still. That is a very specific suggestion, she said. Yes. How specific is your knowledge of this? I looked at her directly. Specific enough to be useful. Not specific enough to explain yet. She held my eyes for a long moment. The garden was quiet. Below us, the cloud sea moved in its slow, enormous way, indifferent to the conversation happening above it. Yet, she said. Yet. She stood. She looked down at me with those layered amber eyes, and I had the distinct and not uncomfortable sensation of being seen very clearly by someone very capable of seeing clearly. When you are ready to explain, she said. I will be listening. She left. I watched her go. The empire she ruled, I thought, had no idea how fortunate it was to have her. Some rulers survive because of the power they wield. She had survived, and would continue to survive because of what she was. And what she was had nothing to do with the power. The power was just what you got when you put what she was in charge of something large. I sat in the garden until the cloud sea went dark below me, and the star field above Velkari Prime came out, different from Earth's sky, different arrangement, different density, but still the same profound and anchoring expanse. I had been managing this situation since I set foot on this planet. I had been managing it since before that, if I was honest. Managing was what I did. It was the skill I had built everything else around, the capacity that had kept me alive and effective in the positions that I should not, by any reasonable measure, have survived. I was very good at managing things. What I was discovering, slowly and with some surprise, was that there was one variable in this situation I had stopped treating as something to manage. I was going to have to be careful about that. But not tonight. Tonight the Drakvor ambassador was making his calls, and tomorrow, the palace's internal security division was going to discover a compromised kitchen supply manager, and in 4 days the fleet my people had positioned at the edge of this system's outer boundary would complete their repositioning to a location that matched, precisely, the disposition of the Drakvor warships that Rethvar had been quietly vectoring toward this system for the past 3 months. I had a plan. I always had a plan. I just hadn't planned for the part where the plan started to feel like it was the least interesting thing happening. The Drakvor fleet came out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Velkari system at the 2nd hour of the morning, and I was standing in the war chamber 3 minutes later. I want to explain what the war chamber of the Velkari Imperial Palace looks like, because the setting matters. It is a circular room cut from a single enormous piece of the same deep red stone as the rest of the palace, lit by a ring of permanent light fixtures that cast no shadows and leave no corners. The floor is a physical holographic display that can render any scale of tactical map. The walls hold status screens and communication relays for the entire Imperial military network. It smells faintly of the mineral dust that gets into everything in this city, and of the particular metallic tension that a room generates when the people in it are afraid. There were 11 people in the room when I arrived. The 6 who were speaking all stopped at the same moment. The 5 who were not speaking were standing in positions that told me who had rank, who was managing their fear well, and who was managing it poorly. Jalsareth was at the center of the room. She had clearly been awake. She was dressed in the working uniform of the Imperial Command, rather than anything ceremonial, and she had the focused quality of a person who had shifted from sleep to crisis management, without any intermediate steps. She looked at me when I entered and said nothing. A chair near the display had been positioned with a clear view of the room. I was not sure if she had put it there, or if it had simply been near her, and she had not moved it. I sat in it. The holographic floor showed the Drakvor fleet, 217 warships, arrayed in a formation that I had been looking at for long enough to know its characteristics. I began doing the analysis before anyone spoke to me, because the analysis was what I was there for, even if no one in this room knew that yet. The fleet was sitting at the outer edge of transit range. They had not advanced. They had sent a communication. This was what had woken the palace, demanding the immediate surrender of the human consort. The Velkari High Council had been assembled in a connected chamber. I could hear them through the open relay, the particular noise of several hundred years of political caution crashing into an unexpected military situation. They were arguing. Some of them were arguing for compliance. The surrender of a foreign consort was, technically, within the bounds of treaty law if the requesting party had legitimate grounds, and some of the council members were already generating reasons why the grounds might be considered legitimate. The chief military commander, a general named Velthek, who I had assessed on day 1 as capable and loyal, and not remotely as capable as he believed he was arguing for a measured defensive posture and requesting authorization to bring the border fleet to ready status. This would take 4 hours. He delivered this assessment with confidence. I looked at the fleet formation for another 30 seconds. Then I said, to the room in general, they are not going to attack. 11 heads turned toward me. Velthek said, in the tone of a man who is in charge of something and does not want that to be unclear, with respect, the consort's presence here is a courtesy of the crown, not a military advisory role. Yes, I said. And the fleet is in a defensive formation. Look at the interval spacing between the center mass vessels. I stood and walked to the edge of the floor display, pointing at the formation without touching it. Offensive formations cluster the heavy vessels forward, within a third of the total depth. These vessels are distributed evenly across the entire formation width. That is a posture you use when you expect return fire and want to distribute the damage. They are not arranged to hit us. They are arranged to survive being hit. Silence. Jalsareth stepped up beside me and looked at the formation. Her eyes moved across it in the particular way she had of processing visual information quickly, not scanning, but taking in the whole and then selecting what to examine. They are afraid, she said. They are very afraid, I said. Which means this isn't a military operation. It's a signal. They want something from this court, and they want it badly enough to put 200 ships in visible range without expecting to use them. I paused. That is actually useful. Velthek said, they want you, specifically. There is something about the human consort that the Drakvor considers sufficiently threatening to deploy a fleet. He said it with the particular tone of someone who has found the key point and is presenting it as an accusation. I looked at him. Then I looked at Zalsarath. She was looking at me. There was something in her expression that I had been watching develop over the weeks I had been in this palace. A layered look, like geological strata, with assessment at the surface, and something I could not name below it. She had been building toward a question for a long time, and the question was about to have no more room to wait. I said to her, quietly enough that it was between us rather than the room, "We need to speak privately, before the council is given any direction." She held my eyes for 3 full seconds. Then she said to the room, "Hold all response communications. No fleet movements. Maintain the defensive screen at current range only." She looked at Velthek. "You have operational authority until I return." She walked toward the side corridor. I followed. The corridor outside the war chamber was small and cold, lit by a single strip of pale blue light along the ceiling. She turned to face me as soon as the door closed behind us. The quality of her attention at close range, when she had decided to focus it fully, was significant. I had experienced being looked at carefully by people trained to look carefully. This was different. This was comprehensive. "I have been patient," she said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the awareness that patience has a natural terminus. "I have watched you navigate my palace for weeks. I have watched you remove at least 2 security threats without leaving any footprint my division could trace. I have watched you speak to the Drakvor ambassador in a language that should not exist in your background. And now the Drakvor have sent a fleet to demand you back." She paused. "Marcus Cole is not your name. Marcus Cole is my name," I said. "Everything on my papers is accurate, but it is not all of your name." I looked at her in the pale blue light of the corridor. The sounds of the war chamber came through the door behind me, muffled, urgent, the sounds of an empire working out how to be afraid without showing it. "No," I said. "It is not all of my name." She waited. I said, "I came here because the treaty needed to be real, not symbolic. Real. I came here because the Drakvor have been working to prevent this alliance for 3 years, because an alliance between your empire and the Confederation is the single strongest stabilizing force in this sector, and because the Drakvor know that, and have been doing everything they can to make sure it never forms." "You came here to spy," she said. "Not an accusation, an analysis. I came here to make sure the conditions for a real alliance existed, which required understanding your court in more depth than any intelligence report can provide." I held her gaze. And then the registry draw happened, and something I had planned as an extended observation became considerably more complicated. She was very still. "Who authorized your presence here?" "The same office that authorized the treaty negotiation. The same office that has been watching the Drakvor positioning for 18 months, and determined that if this treaty failed, the next 12 years in this sector looked like something neither of our peoples wanted." "What office?" she said quietly. "Authorizes that?" I took a breath. "I am going to tell you something that is classified above the level of most of the people who make decisions for my civilization." She waited. "There is a position within the Human Confederation that has no official title, no public record, and no listed occupant. It has existed for 40 years. Its purpose is long-range strategic architecture, identifying the decisions, 10 and 20 years out, that will determine whether humanity survives the next century as a free civilization. The person who holds that position does not attend conferences. They are not in any photograph. Their name does not appear in any document that an external power could obtain." I paused. "The fleet commander, who is about to contact this war chamber, is going to use a specific form of address when he reaches out to the consort's quarters." She looked at me. "He is going to say, 'Sir,'" I said. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed with the faint vibration of the palace's power systems. Then the communication relay on the wall, a standard emergency system, hardwired through the palace's entire network, activated. The voice that came through was the voice of Admiral Pren Cooper, commanding officer of the Confederation's 7th Strategic Fleet, a man who had 40 years of service, and who had, in his career, addressed 3 sitting heads of state and the Confederation's Supreme Council. He said, "Requesting secure connection to the consort's location. Priority 1, for Sir." The word "Sir" fell into the corridor, the way a stone falls into still water, creating an impact, and then rings, and then a silence with a different quality than the one before. Zalsarath looked at me for a long moment. "Sir," she said. I said, "I owe you a complete explanation." "Yes," she said, "you do." A pause. "But not in this corridor." She reached past me and activated the relay. "Connect the Fleet Admiral to the consort's communication channel," she said, with the precise, dry authority of a person who has processed an enormous amount of information and has decided what to do with it. "And inform the War Chamber I will return in 10 minutes with updated strategic direction." She looked at me one more time. Something in her expression had shifted, not broken open, not shocked, but recalibrated. The way a very good navigator recalibrates when a landmark turns out to be farther away and taller than the map said. 10 minutes, she said. "The fleet," I said, "is 3 times the size of the Drakvor Armada, and it has been positioned there for 6 days. She went very still for the 3rd time. Then, 6 days. "Yes." She looked at me with those layered amber eyes, and something moved through them that I would not call anger, exactly, and would not call admiration, exactly, and was probably some combination that did not have a name in either of our languages. 10 minutes, she said again, "and then you are going to explain everything, from the beginning, without selecting." "Yes," I said. She walked back into the war chamber. The door closed behind her. I stood alone in the pale blue corridor, listening to the faint vibration of the palace around me, and thought about the beginning. About how much of it there was. About how, when you had spent 20 years building something in the dark, explaining it in the light was a different and more difficult project than the building had been. The communication relay waited. Pren Cooper's channel was open on standby. I reached for it, and I began to think about how to tell the truth to someone who had every right to be furious about it, and who I was deeply, professionally, and probably irreversibly hoping would not be. I told her at the edge of the palace roof, because that was the only place in the building that I was certain had no recording equipment. I had checked 3 times over the preceding week, just in case this moment came. I had told myself it was contingency planning. That was not entirely honest. She stood with her back to the city and her arms folded across her chest, and she listened. That was the thing about Zalsarath that I had learned to look for and could not stop noticing. She listened completely, not waiting for her turn to speak, not managing her response while the other person was still forming their sentences. She took in what was being said and held it, and turned it over before she responded. It was the rarest quality in any room, in any culture, in any species I had encountered. The roof of the palace was flat, with a low edge of carved stone running along the perimeter. Beyond the edge, the city of Velrath spread in every direction, and beyond the city, the amber cloud sea caught the afternoon light. The air up here was cleaner than at street level, thinner, colder, carrying nothing but the high-altitude mineral sharpness of the plateau. I told her everything. Not in the order I had rehearsed, which surprised me, but in the order the truth required. I told her about the position, what it was, how it had come to exist, what it meant. 40 years ago, the Confederation had commissioned a study into long-range existential threat analysis. The study had produced 2 conclusions. First, that humanity's survival over the next century depended less on military capability than on the quality of the strategic decisions made in the next 20 years. And second, that strategic decisions of that quality could not be produced by committees, councils, or any structure where the need for consensus compromised the integrity of the analysis. They needed one person, one mind that could hold the whole map, all of it, every data stream, every political relationship, every military vector, every economic pressure, and work the problem without interference. The position was created quietly. Its first occupant held it for 18 years and shaped the Confederation's expansion into the Eastern Reach in ways that only became visible much later. When she stepped down, she had chosen her successor. The position passed that way, person to person, without any formal mechanism, and without any external visibility. The current occupant, me, had been in it for 7 years. I told her about my actual name, which was Marcus Hale, and which appeared on no document that was accessible to any power outside the Confederation's innermost strategic circle. I told her about my colony, Crail's point was real. I had grown up there, the youngest of 3 children, in a family that had gone out to the Edge colonies looking for the particular freedom that the Edges still offered. The Drakvor border incident that had destroyed it had been real, and I had not been there when it happened because I had already left, recruited into the intelligence division of the Confederation fleet at 19, by a commander who had noticed something about the way I solved problems. I told her that the Drakvor had been looking for me for 3 years, not for Marcus Cole, for the Architect, which was the name their intelligence division had given to the unknown force that had been quietly dismantling their expansion efforts since I took the position. They had no description. They had no identity. They had patterns, the characteristic shape of a strategic mind working against them, and they were very afraid of what those patterns implied. I told her about the admiral I had contacted that first night, through the emergency chip in my boot, to position the fleet at the edge of the system as a contingency, 6 days before the Drakvor moved. Because I had been watching Rethvar's communication patterns, and I knew what a build toward fleet action looked like when you knew the signs. I told her about the court network I had found and neutralized. I did not tell her about Tharsil, because that was still in progress, and the explanation required a longer conversation. I told her about the data package Selvan had been holding for me, which I had collected on day 11, in a 15-minute window while the palace staff was occupied with a ceremonial preparation. The package was now transmitted and safely received. That was the professional part of my initial mission, and it was complete. And then I told her the rest. I told her that I had come here expecting to be effective. I had expected to handle the mission parameters, understand the court, build the conditions for a genuine alliance, and manage the marriage bond as a structural element of a strategic situation. That was what I had planned. What I had not planned was that the queen I was supposed to understand from a professional distance was, in fact, someone I understood much better up close, and that understanding her up close had become something I had not correctly anticipated. I said, I did not expect to spend time with you and find that you were the most interesting person I had met in the last decade. I did not expect to look forward to the garden conversations. I did not plan for any of that, and I want to be clear that it did not compromise the mission. I kept the mission and the personal element in completely separate compartments. She said nothing. What I am telling you, I said, is that I did not lie to you about anything I said directly. I withheld what I do, and I withheld my full identity, because those were operational necessities. That is different from lying to you. But I understand if you do not see it that way. Silence. The city moved below us. Somewhere in the middle distance, a deep bell rang, one of the city's time markers, the kind that had been ringing on this plateau for 3,000 years. You arranged to be selected, she said. Her voice was even. Yes. You arranged it before the ceremony was announced. I had modeled the probability that a bond offer would be part of the treaty structure. When the announcement came, I was positioned to be in the registry. You studied me. For 2 years. A pause. And the 31-page strategic analysis of the Velkari succession structure that appeared in my intelligence division's secure files, 4 months before the treaty negotiations began? I said nothing. She said, my senior analyst called it the most accurate external assessment of our internal political structure he had ever read. He assumed it came from the Confederation's diplomatic research division. She looked at me with an expression that was doing several things at once. It came from you. The succession structure was relevant to the alliance's long-term stability, I said. If the wrong faction gained influence after your reign, the alliance would collapse within a generation. So you wrote 31 pages to make sure the right faction would be positioned. 33 pages, I said. There were appendices. Something crossed her face. It was not a smile. It was something more complicated than a smile. It was the expression of a being who is very angry and also finds something genuinely funny, and is doing the work of keeping those two things from occupying the same space simultaneously. You are, she said slowly, the most infuriating thing I have encountered in 31 years of ruling an empire. I know, I said. I should have you removed from this palace. You could, I said. That is within your authority. The treaty framework does not require the bond to continue if the crown withdraws consent. She looked at me for a long moment. Is the alliance real? She said. Not the paper, the intent. Is it real? Yes, I said. The Confederation wants this alliance because your empire and ours together represent the only political structure in this sector that can hold the line against the Drakvor's long-range expansion. That is strategy. But strategy and genuine benefit are not mutually exclusive. This alliance is good for both our peoples. I have believed that for 3 years. I still believe it. And you? She said. The word was careful. Not the mission. You. I held her gaze. I came here to build an alliance. I came here for strategic reasons that I believe in completely. A pause. I stayed in the conversations in the garden every evening because I wanted to. That part was not the mission. The city bell rang again. Time moving forward, the way it always did. She turned and looked out at the cloud sea for a while. I waited. This was not a moment that benefited from filling. After a long silence, she said, without turning around, "The Drakvor ambassador requested an audience with me this morning. Before the fleet arrived, he suggested that the human consort was not what he appeared, and that the Confederation had placed an intelligence asset in the palace without the court's knowledge." "He is correct," I said. "He is partially correct," she said. She turned around. "He believes you are a spy. He has not arrived at the rest of it." "No, and I would prefer he didn't. Because if he knows what you actually are, the fleet command panics, and we have a war." "Yes." She was quiet again. Then, "Give me the Drakvor intelligence. Everything you have, not as a gesture, as a professional exchange between two parties who are building something real." I reached into the inside pocket of my coat. The data chip I had been carrying since I left the ship was there. Not Selvan's package, which was already transmitted. This one, the one I had been holding as a reserve, as insurance, as the thing I did not use unless I was certain of the ground I was standing on. I held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. "You're going to be very difficult to manage," she said. "You're the only person I have met in a long time who might be capable of it," I said. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite not one. Then she turned and walked back toward the palace entrance, the data chip in her hand, her posture as straight as it had been on the day of the ceremony, which is to say, perfectly and entirely itself. At the entrance, without turning around, she said, "Come. We have a council to address and a fleet to send home." I followed her back into the palace. It was the first time in 7 years that following someone else's lead had felt like the right thing to do. The coup began at the 4th hour of the night, which was the hour the palace chose because the 4th hour was the quietest, the hour between the last guard rotation and the first light of the system's star, when the palace was at its lowest staff density and the humans who lived here were deepest in sleep. They had planned it carefully. I give them that. I had been planning for it longer. I was not in my rooms when it started. I had not been in my rooms since the 3rd hour, when I had finished the conversation with Zalsarath that had run past midnight, and felt the particular quality of stillness in the palace that meant something had shifted. Not a sound, not a visible movement, just the way the air in a building changes when the intentions inside it change. She had gone to her chambers. I had walked to mine, said good evening to the guard outside my door, gone in, waited 4 minutes, and then left through the second panel in the back of the sleeping room that connected to a maintenance corridor I had mapped on my 3rd day in the palace. I moved through the maintenance system in the dark. I had walked it twice in the daylight, under cover of checking a reported pipe issue that I had invented and then reported through the household staff system. I knew it well enough to navigate it without light, which I did, because light in a maintenance corridor at the 4th hour is the kind of signal that ends opportunities. The coup was being run by a coalition. I had identified the core of it 2 weeks ago, a block of noble faction leaders who had opposed the human treaty from the beginning, funded and coordinated by surviving Drakvor network assets. Tharcel was in it, the advisor I had left in place rather than expose, a decision I had made because she could be redirected. I had been wrong about the timeline. She had been redirected, but by the other side, deeper in, before I could complete that work. The coalition had 2 objectives: remove Zalsarath from power and install a regent from the treaty-opposed faction, and deliver me to the Drakvor fleet that was still sitting at the edge of the system, nominally in a diplomatic holding pattern following the session where Zalsarath had presented the intelligence I had given her, and the fleet had been officially ordered to withdraw. Officially, while in practice shifting to a waiting position that Rethvar had arranged before he was escorted off-planet 2 days earlier. They had approximately 400 armed personnel, drawn from the private guards of the faction leaders and supplemented by Drakvor assets who had been brought in under diplomatic cover over the preceding weeks. They had disabled the palace's main communication relay on the roof. One of the technicians on the night shift was part of the network. They had neutralized Zalsareth's personal guard through a chemical compound in the ventilation of the guard barracks, which put everyone in there into a sleep they would wake from in 6 hours, with headaches but no lasting effects. They had sealed the palace's main external doors from the inside. They were good. The plan was good. The execution was professional. It was not good enough. I had 11 minutes from the moment the barracks ventilation was altered. I had been watching the air circulation monitors on a secondary system I had found in the maintenance corridor, to the moment the main force moved toward Zalsarath's chambers. I used them. I will not describe those 11 minutes in detail, because some things are better left to the imagination. What I will say is that the coup's communication structure relied on a network of 14 signal repeaters placed through the palace to maintain coordination between the 4 groups operating simultaneously. By the 9th minute, 12 of those repeaters no longer functioned. By the 10th minute, the palace armory, a separate wing with its own access system, was locked from the inside on a code that only I knew, because I had added it to the system 8 days earlier, when I had identified the coalition's quartermaster and determined that their weapons access point was that facility. By the 11th minute, I was back in the maintenance corridor and moving toward the section that connected to the residential wing where Zalsareth's chambers were. I came out through a panel in the corridor 30 meters from her door. Her remaining personal guards, the 3 who had been off rotation and were not in the barracks, were already engaged with the lead element of the coup force. 3 guards against 14 armed opponents is a situation with a predictable outcome. I changed the outcome. I will say this. The next 4 minutes were not comfortable. I have been in worse situations, technically speaking, but volume is not the only relevant variable. The corridor was narrow, and there were more of them than was ideal, and the one who came at me from the left was faster than I expected, and connected once before I was able to change that. The result was a cut on my cheek, a bruised shoulder, and 14 opponents who were on the floor in various states of not being a problem anymore. None of them were permanently harmed. I do not work that way, unless I have no alternative, and in a palace corridor in the 4th hour of the night, alternatives existed. I walked to Zalsareth's door. Her 3 guards were standing, 2 of them barely, but standing. I said to them, "The main force is being routed through the East Wing corridor. They will arrive in approximately 4 minutes. I need you to have everyone who is still standing ready at the corridor entrance." The senior guard looked at me. She looked at the 14 people on the floor. She looked back at me. "Yes," she said, with the efficiency of someone who had just recalibrated an entire professional framework in about 2 seconds. I went inside. Zalsarath was standing in the center of the room in her command uniform, which told me she had not been asleep. She had a blade in her right hand, ceremonial by design, functional by quality. She looked at me when I entered, read the cut on my face and the state of my coat in a single glance, and said, "How many?" "The main force is about 300, being routed now. The splinter groups targeting the communication systems and the armory have already been neutralized. The armory is locked. Their coordination network is down." She processed this. "Routed how?" "The corridor system connects to the East Wing atrium. Without communication coordination, the groups are going to converge there, because it is the last rally point on their operational plan. They will arrive expecting to regroup. What they will find is that the atrium has 3 entrances, and the only one that will be open is the one facing the throne room corridor." She was quiet for 1 beat. "You funneled them. They will enter the throne room corridor in a group rather than dispersed. Your guards, positioned at the far end, will meet them in a contained space with a 3-to-1 advantage on effective firing angle." I paused. "It is not a comfortable situation for either side, but it is survivable for yours, and considerably less so for theirs." She looked at me for a moment. Then she moved toward the door, blade still in hand, and said, "Walk with me." We walked. The confrontation in the throne room corridor lasted approximately 6 minutes of genuine engagement, and then broke apart, as the coup forces realized that their coordination was gone. Their weapons supply was unavailable for resupply, and the tactical situation had turned against them in ways that none of their planning had prepared them for. The faction leaders were detained. The Drakvor assets, the ones who had not already slipped through side exits, were taken by the palace guard. Afterward, Zalsareth stood in the corridor and looked at the result of the night with the particular expression of a ruler, taking inventory of what had been preserved and what had been lost, and what the accounting meant going forward. She looked at the cut on my cheek. "You need attention for that," she said. "It is not serious. It is on your face." She said it with a precision that was not exactly personal, and not exactly not. A palace medic arrived 20 minutes later and dealt with the cut while I sat in a chair in the outer hall, and Zalsareth stood nearby, conducting rapid assessments with her staff. I watched her work. She was already 3 moves ahead, not reacting to the coup, but reconfiguring the political landscape it had revealed. Which faction leaders were detained? Which ones had been involved but were not yet identified? What the next 48 hours needed to produce in terms of public messaging and internal restructuring. She was very good. She was also, I noticed, staying in the same room as me when her other business could have taken her anywhere in the palace. When the medic finished, I said to her, "There is a senior advisor named Tharsel." She said, without looking up from the report she was reading, "I know." I waited. She said, "She came to me 2 hours before the coup began. She told me everything, the timeline, the force disposition, the communication structure." She looked up. She said a conversation she had with someone 3 weeks ago made her reconsider what she thought she was loyal to. I said nothing. "Was that conversation with you?" She said. I said, "I left some materials in a location where she would find them. Information about what the Drakvor intended for this empire after the treaty failed. I thought it might be useful to her." Zalsareth studied me. "You were not certain it would work?" "No, it was a low probability approach. I was going to take a different route if it failed." "But you tried it first." "She deserved the chance to make a better choice," I said. She had been misled. It seemed worth finding out if she would correct it when the misleading was removed. A long pause. Outside the hall windows, the first light of the system's star was beginning to touch the edge of the cloud sea. The night was almost over. She said, "The data I gave to the War Council from the intelligence package you provided, the Drakvor internal positioning, the faction maps, the financial flows. My strategic division says it is the most complete picture of a rival power's internal structure we have obtained in 50 years. It should be useful," I said. "It is more than useful. It is enough to disassemble their expansion from within over the next decade, without a military confrontation that either side could afford." She paused. "You had that. You were holding it." "It was reserve material, for when I was certain it could be used correctly." "And now you are certain." "I gave it to you before the coup," I said. "That should tell you something about the certainty." She looked at me for a moment that had a different quality than the other moments. Then she said, "The Confederation fleet is asking for direction. Admiral Cooper would like to know his orders. His orders are to stay where they are until the Drakvor fleet withdraws completely, and then to begin the formal positioning for joint patrol of the Eastern Corridor as agreed in the treaty framework. He should coordinate with your fleet admiral directly." She raised one precise eyebrow. "You are giving orders to my fleet admiral?" "I was suggesting a coordination framework." "You are giving orders to my fleet admiral," she said again, with the same tone but a different meaning. "I thought joint patrol was in the treaty framework." "It is. I approved it." She paused. 3 weeks ago, after reading an analysis that appeared in my strategic planning files with no author listed. I said nothing. 34 pages, she said, with appendices. We stood in the early light, and the city began its daily business below the windows, and somewhere in the system, the two fleets watched each other, across a distance that was, for the first time in a long time, not an argument. The formal announcement was made at the second hour of the afternoon, in the Great Hall, before the assembled court and the full diplomatic corps of every major power, with a presence on Velkari Prime. I stood beside Zalsareth on the raised platform, which was where I had stood on the day of the ceremony, and I watched the assembled court and thought about how different the quality of the silence was now. On the first day, the silence had been the silence of beings who did not know what to make of something. This silence was different. This was the silence of beings who were in the process of revising an entire set of assumptions, and who were still in the middle of that revision, and who were watching carefully to see what the final shape of the thing was going to be. Zalsareth spoke for 9 minutes. I will not reproduce the speech here because it was hers, and it belongs to the record of her reign, not to my account of it. But I will say what it contained: a full disclosure of the events of the previous night, without softening and without political management. A disclosure of who I was, not everything, but enough. The role, the function, the decision she had made after I told her. She said, "He did not deceive this court about his character. He withheld his function. The distinction matters. Every being in this room has information they do not share until they are certain it will be used correctly. I have made a career of it. I am not prepared to hold another being to a standard I do not meet myself." The court was very quiet. She said, "I name him Consort Architect of the Velkari Empire. The title is new. It will mean what he makes of it." I looked out at the assembled court, 400 beings in the formal robes of the most powerful empire in this sector of the galaxy, and I felt something that I did not have a quick word for. It was not pride exactly. It was the particular sensation of something you have been building for a long time becoming visible, and finding that the visible version was both what you intended and something more than what you intended, at the same time. After the hall, after the formal reception, after the hours of structured diplomatic interaction that followed a major announcement, Zalsareth found me in the eastern garden at the usual hour. The cloud sea below was the deep purple-orange of late afternoon, and the temperature had dropped to the cold sharpness that came with the system star's lower angle. I had my coat on. She had not brought one, which I had noticed was consistent. The Velkari ran warmer than humans, and she particularly seemed unaffected by temperature that I would have called uncomfortable. She sat on the bench across from mine. We were quiet for a while. That was one of the things I had learned about her over the weeks. She used silence well. She did not fill it. She let it be what it was. I said, "The new threat is real." She said, "Tell me." I had been preparing how to tell her for 3 days. Not managing the information, preparing to give it honestly, which was a different kind of preparation. I told her about the stillness. I used the name my intelligence division had assigned to it because we did not have a better one. It was not a civilization in the conventional sense. It was not a military power. It was something older than either of those categories. A vast, distributed intelligence that had been moving through this galaxy for a span of time that put every current political structure into a very uncomfortable perspective. It did not conquer. It did not destroy in the conventional sense. It consumed complexity. It absorbed the active intelligence of civilizations, reduced them to quiet, to stillness, to a kind of imposed equilibrium that looked peaceful from the outside, and was, from any perspective that valued the capacity to choose, the end of everything that mattered. My division had been tracking signs of its approach for 6 years, the outer surveys, the disappearances of certain kinds of active signal from deep field observation, the particular pattern of very old ruins that appeared in every direction if you looked at the deep survey data with the right framing. It had been doing this for approximately 10,000 years. The galaxy's silence, in so many of the directions where signals should have been, was not absence. It was the result of what the stillness left behind. Zalsareth listened to all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long? Before it reaches the edge of this sector? My best estimate is 40 years. Maybe 50. The uncertainty range is wide." "And your plan?" I looked at the cloud sea. 40 years is enough time to build something. "If we build the right thing," she said. "What is the right thing?" I looked at her. "An alliance between the two most capable powers in this sector, with a combined intelligence architecture and military structure that does not exist yet, but could exist, if we begin now. A genuine shared project with a shared understanding of what we are building toward. Not a paper treaty, a real collaboration, between my empire and your confederation." "Yes." She looked at me for a while. "You planned for this too." "I hoped for this," I said. "Planning requires more certainty than I had. There is a difference between those two things." "Yes," I said, "there is." The cloud sea moved. The star fell lower. The air got colder, and neither of us moved to go inside. she said. I have ruled this empire for 31 years. I have made decisions in that time that I was certain about, and decisions that I was not, and I have learned that the uncertain ones require more honesty than the certain ones. Because when you are certain, you can afford to hide your reasoning. When you are not certain, you need the other person to tell you what you missed. Yes, I said. I am not certain about this. Neither am I. But you have the beginning of a plan. I always have the beginning of a plan. She made the sound that was not quite a smile. Tell me the first 3 moves. I told her the first 3 moves. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when I finished, she sat with it for a while, and then asked 2 questions that I had not asked myself, and that, when I worked through them, required me to revise one of the 3 moves significantly. I revised it. She said nothing about the revision. She simply accepted it and moved to the implications. We talked until it was dark and the star field had come out, and the city below had shifted from the sounds of the day to the quieter, deeper sounds of the evening. Neither of us had said anything about going inside. At some point I said, "The Confederation Council is going to want me back. What will you tell them?" What I told Admiral Cooper. I am where I need to be. She looked at the star field. And where is that? I looked at it too. Here is where the work is. The work, she said, with the specific inflection of someone who is acknowledging that a word is carrying more than its surface meaning. Yes, I said, the work. She was quiet for a while. 40 years, she said finally. Maybe 50. That is a long time to build something. It is also a long time to not start. She stood. She looked at the star field once more, the vast, bright, and now differently understood expanse of it, and then she looked at me. "In the morning," she said, "I want a full strategic review, both our intelligence divisions, joint session. I want a map of everything we know about the stillness's movement patterns, overlaid with our combined sensor network coverage. I can have a preliminary framework ready by the first hour," I said. "Of course you can," she said, and went inside. I stayed in the garden for a while longer. The city moved below me, and the cloud sea moved below the city, and above everything the star field spread in its old and enormous way, containing things we had not yet learned to name. Somewhere in that direction, deep, far, in the quiet spaces between the signals that should have been there, something was moving, something that had ended 10,000 years of civilizations by making them still. I thought about what we were building, the shape of it, the scope of it, 2 empires learning to share the same horizon. I thought about the things I had not planned for, and had found anyway, the conversations in the garden, the quality of her thinking, the particular way she revised a position when revision was warranted, without making it an event. I was not afraid. I had done the analysis. I knew what the stillness was, and I knew what kind of response it required, and I knew, with the particular precision of someone who has spent 20 years learning how much one mind can hold, and what it can do with what it holds, that the response was possible. The first 3 moves were already in motion. The 4th and 5th were taking shape. The shape was right. I could feel it in the way a plan feels when the structure is honest, not forced, not wishful, but grounded in what was actually true about the situation. A warship would leave the Valkyrie yards in 18 months. It was already an initial design. It would carry both flags, not one primary and one secondary. Both flags, identical placement, identical size, because some things needed to be said by their structure before anyone opened their mouth. I had suggested the name 3 weeks ago, through channels, in a document that would reach the yards under Zal-Sarath's direction. The name was the same word in both languages, which was a coincidence that was not a coincidence. The word meant, the thing that does not stop. I looked at the star field one more time. Then I went inside. There was work to do in the morning, and the morning was already on its way, and somewhere in the deep dark of this beautiful, complicated, and entirely worth-saving galaxy, something very old was about to encounter something it had not planned for either. That made 2 of us. I found I was looking forward to the introduction,